Next, on Public Lives, Pulitzer Prize-winning historian David Herbert Donald explores the friendships of Abraham Lincoln in his latest, We Are Lincoln Men. It lasts an hour.
David Herbert Donald is clearly the world's leading expert on Abraham Lincoln, the man and the president. Though his famous book, Lincoln, is universally considered the definitive biography of the president, Professor Donald uses his new book, We Are Lincoln Men, to reveal another, often overlooked side of this legend. Professor Donald explores the life of one of the most private and mysterious presidents through the eyes of his closest friends and offers valuable insights into how his relationships affected his presidency. Professor Donald's book, Lincoln, won the prestigious Lincoln Prize and was a bestseller. He has twice won the Pulitzer Prize for a biography. In 1961 for Charles Sumner and the Coming of the Civil War, and in 1988 for Look Homeward, A Life of Thomas Wolfe. He is the Charles Warren Professor Emeritus of American History and American Civilization at Harvard University. Please welcome to Chicago, David Herbert Donald.
Oh, thank you very much. It really is a joy to be back in Chicago. Such a wonderful city, such an exciting city. And I've always loved it and hope to come back more and more frequently. I thought I'd talk tonight a little about this new book of mine called We Are Lincoln Men, and perhaps I ought to begin by explaining the title. It comes from a letter that John Hay, one of Lincoln's private secretaries, wrote to his other secretary, John G. Nicolay, in the 1880s when they were preparing their, they thought, definitive 10-volume magisterial biography of Lincoln using the Lincoln Papers for the first time. They were both ardent Republicans, but they didn't want to make this sound like a campaign document in 10 volumes. So Hay wrote to Nicolay, we want to seem absolutely impartial in our presentation. We want readers to think of us as two seraphims on clouds above, twanging their harps impartially as they recount the history of the war. And then Hay said, but there's one reservation about this. We do remember all the way through that we are Lincoln men. This is a book about people who thought of themselves as Lincoln men. They were close friends, they thought, of Lincoln, and their relationship to Lincoln, I think, tells something about them. It tells even more about the president, and I hope it tells something about the importance of friendship in history. Now, shortly after Lincoln's assassination, people, biographers, historians, began asking questions, naturally enough, of how did this man who came from such an undistinguished background, who had hard-scrabble beginnings, who had little education, who had no wealth, he had no family behind him, how did such a man rise to power, to success, and how did he come to be so completely capable as president? When they asked these questions about those who had known Lincoln back in his Illinois days, they got almost always the same kinds of answers. They were told again and again that Lincoln rose because of his capacity to make and to hold friends. For instance, just take one little episode. During his brief service in the Black Hawk War in the 1830s, he so endeared himself to the men in his company that 30 years later, they remembered Lincoln was our idol, one soldier said. There was not a man but was obedient to every word he spoke and would fight to the death for Lincoln. All the men in the company, said another, as well as the regiment to which he and they belonged, claimed that they almost worshipped Lincoln. In every phase of his life, he attracted such devoted kinds of followers, so that one old-timer out in New Salem, when asked the secret of Lincoln's success, gave a succinct 5-word explanation. He said, Lincoln had nothing but friends. But the same people began asking other people who knew Lincoln perhaps even better and more intimately over a longer period of time, and they rejected that explanation. John Todd Stewart, Lincoln's first law partner, thought that Lincoln was incapable of friendship. Lincoln did forget his friends. Stewart said, there was no part of his nature which drew him into acts of gratitude for his friends. He was by some considered cold-hearted, at least indifferent toward his friends, agreed another Illinois politician who worked with him for 30 years. He was the warm friend of few men, said Governor Oglesby of Illinois. He added a bit lamely, but he was the friend of mankind. David Davis, the judge who was responsible more than any other man for Lincoln's nomination in 1860, said Lincoln had no strong emotional feelings for any person, for mankind or thing. And William Henry Herndon, Lincoln's law partner for 16 years, agreed with these appraisals. Lincoln, he said, rose through his own exertions. He did not rise because he had friends. He was, Herndon declared, the most shut-mouthed man who ever existed. I love that phrase, shut-mouthed man. Isn't that a wonderful phrase to describe a politician who does not reveal his secrets? But here then is my problem and my paradox. I would like to explore how a man who had no intimate friends was also a man who had nothing but friends. And that is the theme of this new book. In working on it, I think of it as an exploration in not merely of Lincoln and Illinois and of the Civil War period, but an exploration of friendship, the meaning of friendship, and of its significance as shaping political and public behavior. To do this, I found it very difficult to know exactly where to go for sources. Naturally, I went back to the records of the time. I went back to the interviews that Herndon collected to find out what his so-called friends said about Lincoln, and got remarkably little out of them. I turned next to the works of some sociologists and educators who've done important work in studying the importance of friendship, especially in the early years. And I learned even more from conversations and correspondence with some leading psychoanalysts who explore the problems caused by the lack of close friends. But even these did not satisfy me. The work of these specialists led me back to the history of philosophy. And I began reading, improbably enough for an American historian, what Montaigne, what Thomas Aquinas, and what Cicero had to say about friendship. And in turn, all of these ultimately led me back to Aristotle. Aristotle made the basic and still enduring typology, the classifications of friendship that really all subsequent works have drawn on and have echoed. According to Aristotle, there are three kinds of friendships. There are the pleasurable friendships, there are the useful friendships, and the perfect friendships. And Abraham Lincoln's life gives a very good opportunity for examining all three kinds of friendships. Now, many of Lincoln's associates fell clearly into Aristotle's category of pleasurable friendships. Lincoln simply enjoyed being with some men. I don't include women there because Lincoln was never comfortable around women, really any women at all. But among some men, he was very comfortable, and he just enjoyed being with them. For example, in his early days out in New Salem, he enjoyed being with the roughnecks of the Clary's Grove area, who would come into town on the weekends, and they would drink a great deal, and they would raise hell generally. He also enjoyed, though, more than that, racing with them. And of course, with his long legs, he could outrace anybody. Wrestling, and he was extremely good at that. And other sports are like that. Now, there was very little there of intellectual companionship, but they enjoyed being together. He enjoyed these relations, and they did too. In the years ahead, they would be some of his very strongest supporters. They would go around with him on campaigns and go to elections and sometimes keep order among disorderly crowds so that their peer Lincoln could be heard. They loved him, and they followed him, and they enjoyed him. He enjoyed these associations a great deal. For instance, when the Black Hawk War, which I've already mentioned, broke out in the 1830s, the Indian chief Black Hawk had come back into Illinois to reclaim lands he claimed had been taken from him by the government. There was a war to drive him out. Lincoln and the other young men were subjected to the call to the militia, and of course they all served. In those days, when the militia was called out, they gathered at some central place, usually a pasture or some green, and they then elected their own officers. Somebody would nominate one, somebody would nominate another. In the case of Lincoln's company, somebody nominated, everybody expected to be elected, a wealthy mill owner named Kirkpatrick. And so he was nominated, he stood out in front, and his followers were supposed to stand behind him. Somebody then nominated, to his surprise, really, Lincoln, and he stood out here. And the men began moving over. 2/3 of them followed Lincoln. Only a handful stood behind Kirkpatrick. And presently they looked around, they didn't want to be alone, so they drifted over there too, leaving that poor man over there all by himself. So Lincoln was himself elected. This was something that gave him enormous pleasure. He remembered it the rest of his life. Years later, after he had served 4 terms in the state legislature, after he served as in the House of Representatives in Washington, after he had twice been the candidate of his party for the United States Senate, he still remembered this honor. He declared that his election as militia captain was a success which gave me more pleasure than any I have had since. This was the nature of Lincoln's enjoyable friendships. Throughout his life, though, Lincoln also associated himself with people who fell into Aristotle's second category, that of the useful friendship. And he never hesitated about drawing on them for help. Very early, when elected to the state legislature at the age of, I believe it's 23, he realized that he didn't have any clothes to wear as he went to Vandalia. He said the sort of rags that he went around New Salem in. He had to make a respectable appearance, he said. So he went out to a wealthy property owner near New Salem named Coleman Smoot and said to him, I need $200 to make a respectable showing in Vandalia. Will you lend it to me? Smoot, who was a useful friend, said, of course I will. Without hesitating, he gave him the $200. There was no note, there was no interest. What could Lincoln have put up in the way of interest? He had no money whatsoever. He knew that he would ultimately be repaid. Lincoln, by the way, took the $200, spent $60 of it on his first suit of clothes. Now, that doesn't sound like a lot to us these days, but if you allow for inflation, that would be at least $600, which is quite a lot of money to pay for a suit for a man who had never had one before. Such useful friends surrounded Lincoln throughout his life, and they helped him. There was one, for example, who gave him free room and board while he was studying to be a surveyor. Another lent him law books so he could pass the bar. Still another fed and clothed him while he went to Springfield to get his practice of law started. Herndon, his young law partner, was his dog's body. He did everything for him. He managed the office. He kept up the books of the office. He looked up references in the state library. He collected political references for Lincoln's campaign speeches. Now, according to Aristotle, people do not shift from one category of friendship to another. If you are a useful friend, you are not an enjoyable friend, and you're not so on. But this was not true in Lincoln's case. In Lincoln's case, many times, the useful friend also gradually became an enjoyable friend. Such was his connection with William Henry Seward, his Secretary of State. You all know that Seward had been a leader in the Republican Party in the formation of that party, had hoped for the nomination in 1860, had been bitterly disappointed when Lincoln, rather than he, was chosen to head the Republican Party. And for a time there, it seemed that he was just going to sulk and not be part of the new administration. Lincoln knew he needed to co-opt Seward. He was the head of an important faction of the Republican Party, so he offered him the premier post in his administration, that of Secretary of State. Seward hesitated, but ultimately decided, well, he would indeed take it. He thought he would be the premier of the administration, that he would run the government, while Lincoln would be largely an inexperienced figurehead who simply served in a nominal capacity. Even before Lincoln was inaugurated, Seward made it clear that he intended and wanted to dominate the cabinet. when he learned that his Republican rival, Salmon P. Chase, was going to be nominated to that cabinet too, he dashed off a hasty note to Lincoln. You can see the note from the note itself that it was a hasty production. He just sort of squiggled it off in his indecipherable handwriting. Dear Mr. President, circumstances have arisen that prevent me from accepting the appointment that I previously mentioned. I wish you well, William Henry Seward. He was not going to have a rival in the cabinet. Now, Lincoln knew very well that this was a dangerous situation. He needed Seward in his cabinet. He couldn't afford to have him withdraw. On the other hand, he couldn't, as he told Nicolay, his secretary, private secretary, I can't afford to let Seward take the first trick. So what he did was to let seep out a rumor that the president had heard Seward was not happy with being Secretary of State, that Lincoln might appoint him minister to Great Britain, and that if he did, there would be a vacancy in the State Department to which Lincoln would undoubtedly appoint someone else who was considered hostile to New York state interests. Now, counting on Seward's self-interest and on his self-importance, Lincoln thought he could bluff him into saying, well, I guess I really have to serve, and he was absolutely correct. Seward brooded over it, and then writing to his wife that, I'm afraid that I don't dare to go home and I don't dare to go to England and leave the country to chance, he accepted, and he, of course, joined the cabinet. Now, the two men initially worked on a rather distant, formal kind of relationship. But presently, that formality, that usefulness, became really much more enjoyable. Seward lived in a house that was diagonally across Lafayette Park from the White House. Mrs. Seward often was not in Washington. Mrs. Lincoln was often otherwise occupied. So in evenings, very frequently, Lincoln would stroll across Lafayette Park over to Seward's house. He would find him free, and they would sit in Seward's study, and Seward would recline in his great easy chair with a snifter of brandy and one of his infernal black cigars, poking smoke all over the place. And Lincoln would, President of the United States, put his feet up on the fender of the fireplace, and they would tell stories, and they would swap anecdotes and news and gossip. And presently they got really to like each other. And this in turn grew into a joking kind of friendship. For instance, one morning early on in the administration, Seward, coming over to the White House to check on how things were going, found, I love this, the President of the United States shining his shoes there in the marble halls of the White House. Mr. President, said the secretary, in Washington we do not blacken our own shoes. Oh, said Lincoln, looking up. Well, Mr. Secretary, whose shoes do you blacken then? Another day, when they were walking down Pennsylvania Avenue, and again, this gives something of the flavor of the time. Here we are in the middle of a civil war. Washington's threatened, armies fighting. The President of the United States, 6'4" tall, his Secretary of State, who was a little more than 5 feet tall, walk arm in arm, unescorted, unguarded, down Pennsylvania Avenue, window shopping. And they look into the windows, what's being sold and what's going on. And above the street, Lincoln sees a new sign hanging out over the street. It says, T.R. Strong. Look, says Lincoln, who could never resist a pun, no matter how dreadful it was. Look, he says, Seward, T.R. Strong, but coffee are stronger. And the President and the Secretary of State joined whoops of laughter in the middle of Pennsylvania Avenue. One more round of this, maybe wouldn't be out of order. A little later on in the war, Lincoln and Seward were riding in Virginia to see the troops. The roads were miserable, rutted, and the driver of the carriage was bursting out in most profane language possible, whipping his poor horses to pull them along. And Lincoln rapped on the ceiling of the carriage. Driver, he said, are you an Episcopalian? The driver, astonished, looked. No, Mr. President, he said, I ain't much of anything, but when I go to the church at all, I guess I go to the Methodist church. Oh, says Lincoln, Seward beside him, oh, says Lincoln, I thought you must be an Episcopalian. You swear just like Governor Seward here, and he's an Episcopal church warden. It was that kind of go back and forth relationship that they both enjoyed. It was useful, and it was also pleasurable. Now, Relaxing and pleasurable as such friendships were, none of them ever reached Aristotle's third category, the perfect friendship between men. Now, that's Aristotle's phrasing. These days, we would not use his sexist terminology. We'd say between women, too. But Aristotle was talking about men. Such a perfect friendship is not based on interest, it's not based on hope for advancement, but simply on the love that good men have for other good men, and they love each other because of their goodness. This was the friendship of Damon and Pythias. This was the friendship of David and Jonathan. This was the perfect friendship, and perfect friendships are rare. Even Aristotle, who was surrounded by disciples and sycophants, supposed to have said on his deathbed, my friends, there is no true friend. And certainly Lincoln had trouble finding a true friend. The explanation is not quite clear. There are probably several reasons for it. Perhaps this was because in his boyhood, the Lincolns lived in such an isolated area in southern Indiana, where there were so few people that there were literally no other boys that were Lincoln's age for him to play with. Spencer County in southern Indiana, an area of about the size of Rhode Island, had approximately 200 families. And we've gone over the tax records very closely and find that there were in that whole area maybe somewhere in the neighborhood of 7 or 9 boys who might have been more or less of Abraham's age. But they were scattered. It's like being in one part of Rhode Island and another in the other part of Rhode Island. There was nobody close enough to play with, to see, to enjoy, to confide in on a day-by-day basis. Perhaps Lincoln's failure to find a friend in these days also had something to do with the early death of his mother when he was only about 10 years old. That death left Lincoln emotionally paralyzed, as the death of a parent does for a small child, and he was unable to build close emotional ties to others close around him. Whatever the explanation, Lincoln lacked an essential childhood experience, that is, of having a chum, a pal, a person of his own age and sex in whom he could confide freely, whose friendship was something that would help him define himself and give himself autonomy. Psychoanalysts like Harry Stack Sullivan tell us that a boy who's never had a chum is likely to find it difficult in later life to establish close emotional ties. To digress a moment, I've been working on friendship for a long, long time and boring everybody about my talk about it. Not too long ago, before this book was published, I was having an annual examination at one of the great Boston hospitals, and the head of one of the major departments was poking in, probing the way doctors do. And I suppose to relax me, he said, tell me what you're working on. And I said, I'm working on my friendship, and talked about the importance of friendship and of having a chum, and how the boy who doesn't have a chum is going to be emotionally deprived all of his life. And I looked up at this great man, this great doctor who's respected all over the world. I looked up and tears were running down his face. He said, I never had a friend. I felt so sad, I didn't know what to say, and I still don't know what I should have said to this poor man. But it is quite clear that the boy who does not have a friend, who does not have a chum in youth, is very likely to be an isolate later on, and there are good studies suggesting that they may also become moody and depressed. The melancholy that surrounded Abraham Lincoln throughout most of his life may have stemmed from failing to have such an intimate connection in his youth. Lincoln was nearly 30 years old when he finally found the perfect friend, a real true friend. After working for many years in New Salem, as you all know, as riverboat man, as storekeeper, as postmaster, as surveyor, he decided that he had studied law, he was going to take the bar and going to practice and move to Springfield. New Salem was dying anyway. So borrowing a horse, he couldn't afford one of his own, borrowing some saddlebags, he put on one side his few clothes, on the other side 2 or 3 law books, and jogged into Springfield. He looked around for a place to stay, and there was nothing that he could afford. He wanted to find lodgings, and they were too expensive. So he poked into the general store on the town square there in Springfield. It sold everything, and he thought he might buy equipment there, perhaps for bedding. He met a young man there named Joshua Fry Speed, who was one of the part owners of the store. And he asked him, what would it cost if I bought a mattress, a blanket, a couple of pillows, a couple of sheets? And Speed jotted down the figures and totaled them up and said, that's going to cost you $17. And Lincoln said, I don't have $17. I don't have that amount of money. He asked for credit until Christmas, saying, if my lawyering experience succeeds, I'll pay you off then. And then adding sorrowfully, and if I fail in this, I don't think I can ever pay you. Now, Speed, who barely knew Lincoln at all, saw how averse he was to getting into debt and thought he had a way of avoiding a problem. He said, I have a solution here. Upstairs, he said, I have a very large room with a double bed in it. If you want to share it with me, you're welcome, and I'll be glad to have you. Where is the room? Said Lincoln. Oh, it's up those stairs, said Speed. Lincoln picked up his saddlebags, trots upstairs. You hear the rustling for a minute or two. There's a thump as he drops the saddlebags on the floor, and within a minute, he comes down to his face, beaming that marvelous smile that went from ear to ear. Well, he says, Speed, I've moved. And for the next 4 years, the two men shared a room and a bed. This was intimate on many levels. It was an unlikely friendship, I must say. Lincoln was tall, he was gawky, he had awkward manners that betrayed his hardscrabble beginnings. Speed, much shorter, 4 years younger, had the elegance and self-possession that came from being the son of a great Kentucky planter who owned 70-odd slaves, who lived in grand style in Kentucky. Speed had been educated in the best private academies and had attended college in Kentucky. Lincoln, as he himself said, had an aggregate of education of less than 1 year. But they were remarkably compatible nevertheless. Perhaps this is because they were both from Kentucky. Perhaps it was because they were both deeply interested in politics, both being Whigs opposed to the Jacksonians. Perhaps it was because they both loved poetry. Lincoln could recite great glouts of Shakespeare and many of the poems of Robert Burns, while Speed preferred those of Lord Byron. Speed was mostly a quiet listener, though he had a good sense of humor, but Lincoln was an endless source of anecdotes and untold tales. Indeed, his reputation gradually grew so that after the store hours were over, the young men of Springfield began to gather at Lincoln and Speed's around the big pot-bellied stove at night to hear more tales, and they would tell each other stories, they would recite poems, and they would debate informally and talk about public issues. But the strongest tie between Speed and Lincoln was none of these. It was their desire to get married. Much admired in the best Springfield circles, Speed was in love with the beautiful, pious, but unapproachable Matilda Edwards, the daughter of a very wealthy Illinois resident, who perhaps had doubts about his purity of character. Lincoln, on the other hand, who had just ditched Mary Owens, an unsuitable young woman out in New Salem, was directing his attentions toward Mary Todd, a Kentucky belle who was visiting her relatives in Springfield. And so they both were engaged in courtship at the same time. For nearly 2 years, they indulged in the most protracted and often animated discussions of their potential marital affairs. In what you could think of as the first phase of this discussion, Lincoln, by this point, has become engaged to Mary Todd, and then once he does so, he has doubts. Am I ready to get married? Can I support a wife? Is this the wife for me? And he asks Speed, how can I break this engagement off? And Speed gives him advice. He tells him not to do it, basically. At this point, then, Speed goes back to Kentucky and finds his sweetheart there, a lady named Fanny Hennings, and he becomes engaged to her, and he too has doubts. And now he writes to Lincoln saying, I'm engaged, but I have my doubts. I'm not sure that either sexually or emotionally I can satisfy this young woman. Maybe I shouldn't get married at all. And Lincoln advises him, you go ahead and get married. Third phase, Speed is married by this time, and Lincoln writes him one of those peculiar letters in the whole Lincoln repertoire. Says, this is an embarrassing letter to write. It's more personal than anything that I've ever said. And if you were not such a close friend, I wouldn't dare ask it. But I simply have to ask you, how is your marriage working out? I'm back with Mary Todd, and I'm not sure how it's going to work. But if your marriage isn't working, I'm not sure I should proceed further. Speed reassured him, and so Lincoln got married, and Speed got married. And that was the end of that. If the story didn't deal with such serious matters, you would think of it as a kind of French farce in 3 acts. A recent writer has dealt better with it by saying that Lincoln and Speed were playing the role of doctor and patient. And phase 1, it is Lincoln who's the patient, Speed gives the advice. Phase 2, Speed is in trouble, Lincoln doctors him. Phase 3, Lincoln's again in trouble, Speed tells him what to do. And that's the way they played it out. Then after the 2 men were married, Speed moved permanently back to Kentucky. It was hard to keep up such a close friendship, and over the years, the paths diverged. They differed on issues like slavery, where Speed resisted any attempt to curb slavery, and Lincoln became increasingly anti-slavery. But even these differences did not make for a break or even a coldness, and when Lincoln was elected, Speed wrote to congratulate him, saying, I know you know that I did not support you for president, but I think the country has made a wise choice. Lincoln hoped to have this old close friend go with him to Washington. And in the months while he was president-elect, he invited the Speeds to come to Chicago to meet with him to talk about the future. They did do so. Clearly, he had in mind offering Speed some kind of post in the new administration. But Speed made it clear that he would not leave Kentucky, that his wife didn't want to leave Kentucky, that he was in a very profitable business there in Kentucky and did not want a government job. So he would stay. In the end, his decision may have been fortunate for the country because the Union and Lincoln needed a spokesman to help hold Kentucky in the Union, and Speed's role was a very important one. And during the months ahead, Speed would from time to time go to Washington and visit Lincoln and talk with him. But of course, he didn't see him frequently, and the old intimacy was gone. The result was that Lincoln, as president, came to Washington with no close friends, with no intimate whatsoever. He was all by himself. Now, I think it would be reasonable for you to ask at this point, saying, well, what do these and the other stories that I tell in We Are Lincoln Men, what do these have to say about any larger kinds of questions? Do they tell us anything about Lincoln's presidency? Do they tell us anything about how the conduct of the war was carried on? Do they suggest that Lincoln could have had better policies if he'd had close, intimate friends? And the answers to such questions necessarily have to be speculative because we don't know what didn't happen. But let me pose for you some counterfactual historical scenarios, things that didn't happen but might have happened. Suppose during the secession crisis, the southern states are pulling out of the Union, South Carolina first, Mississippi second, and so on. Suppose Lincoln had had some close, confidential advisors with a broad southern acquaintance, which Lincoln himself did not have. Lincoln operated throughout the first 2 years of the war under the misapprehension that secession was a minority movement, only a small movement of conspirators in the South, that most white Southerners were loyal Unionists who in the next election would put these conspirators down. This obviously was a great misconception. But he had no one to tell him so. He had no one who traveled in the South to say, look, this is a very dangerous situation. To say, these things must be done if you want to conciliate and win the Unionists in the South. There was no one to perform that function. It seems possible, just possible, I guess, that with better understanding and broader communications, the Union cause in Virginia might have triumphed, and Lincoln might have been able to hold that state in the Union. And you could imagine how different the Civil War would have been had Virginia remained loyal to the Union. But Lincoln had no advisor to tell him how to do that. Well, of course, that didn't happen. Let's take a second scenario that didn't happen. Oddly enough, Lincoln did not like to debate or argue. For a lawyer, you would think that would be his business, but he didn't. It was his pattern, always out in Springfield and later, to like to hear others argue a case back and forth, and he would hear the pros and he would hear the cons, and then he would make up his own mind. He's now in Washington, and he has no friends gathered around Speed's stove. He has no kitchen cabinet like Andrew Jackson. He has nobody to say, look, these are the pros and these are the cons. So he took to developing himself. He developed the habit of setting up for himself, these are the arguments in favor of such a position, and these are the arguments against this position. And having put them that way, he would test them. Often he would test them by trying them out on anybody who would listen. Take the case of emancipation, which became increasingly important in the summer of 1862. Lincoln, of course, was anti-slavery. He would like to free the slaves, but he was under great pressure not to trouble the South's peculiar institution at a time that the Union was not winning the war. In the summer of 1862, though, the pressures for emancipation grew so great that he took 2 of his cabinet officers out for a carriage ride and said to them, look, the pressures are so great that I think I'm going to have to issue a proclamation of emancipation. And this news leaked out, and people began to say, that's where the president is going. He got back to the White House, and an old friend from Illinois was visiting, almost the same day. And he told that friend, well, you know, there are pressures for emancipation, but there are great difficulties about it, and I'm not going to issue an emancipation proclamation. If I did, 50,000 soldiers would desert in Kentucky and Tennessee, lay down their arms and join the Confederates, so I won't do it. And that got out. Clearly, people got confused signals. They thought Lincoln was vacillating, that he didn't know his own mind. He did, but he needed to test things out by expressing them verbally. If he had had even 1 or 2 very close friends on whom he could try these ideas first before expressing them publicly, surely there would be less misconception about his policies. It would have been easier to understand, to see where he was going, what he was doing. Let me try a third counterfactual scenario, one that didn't happen. During the Republican Convention of 1864 in Baltimore, which renominated Lincoln for the presidency, Lincoln did nothing whatsoever to express his opinion about who should be the vice presidential choice. Hannibal Hamlin of Maine, his first vice president, had been a perfectly respectable, not distinguished vice president. What vice president ever is distinguished? He was okay. He might have served another term, and he wanted one. But Lincoln did not lift a finger for him. He did not intervene in behalf of anybody else. He let the delegates make their own choice, and for various reasons, they finally wound up choosing Andrew Johnson of Tennessee. They could not have made a worse choice. Andrew Johnson, whatever you can say about his honesty, his integrity, his bravery, his stand in holding his state, or staying in the Union when his state left in secession, he was stubborn, he was vindictive, he was partisan, and he was bigoted. A close friend could have told Lincoln, look, you don't want that kind of man in the White House. A close friend would have examined Andrew Johnson's Senate record to say this is the record that he has of vindictive infighting in the Senate. They would have examined his record as military governor of Tennessee to say he was hostile, he was bitter, he was partisan. You don't want that kind of man. And with such advice, possibly Lincoln could have found someone else, and some of the horrors of Reconstruction might have been avoided. But of course, it didn't happen. None of my scenarios did indeed happen. Now, I find it kind of fun to play with these counterfactual scenarios, to think of the things that didn't happen that might have happened, I think. But all of them perhaps have a questionable first premise. That is, that Lincoln, with his distrust of intimacy, his unwillingness to confide in anybody, even intimates, could ever have been brought to accept the views of a close friend. Certainly no close friend, however dear to him, could have budged him on certain fundamentals. He was inflexibly opposed to any extension of slavery in the national territories. No yield there. He knew with an absolute finality that he would never agree to the dissolution of the Union, so nobody could have counseled him on that. And finally, once he issued the Emancipation Proclamation, he would not have backtracked on it. He made that abundantly clear. But with trusted, experienced friends, perhaps the president might have dealt with these issues rather differently or in a more conciliatory fashion. Not to say that he could have avoided the Civil War, but at least he might have muffled some of the battering criticism that beleaguered Lincoln and his administration during the war. And surely, if Lincoln had been surrounded by friends in the White House, by trusted friends, he would have lived a happier, less isolated, a less anguished life. Milton Eisenhower wrote about the president's need for a close personal friend in the White House. He knew this at firsthand because of his close relationship to his brother, President Eisenhower. Milton Eisenhower wrote, "Most persons in leadership authority like to think out loud with someone he deems to be intelligent, well-informed, conscious of all the nuances from fiscal policy to political possibility, can be trusted absolutely never to divulge a secret, and whom he admires. It's that kind of person who should be the president's principal confidant." And Milton Eisenhower was Eisenhower's confidant. Some of our greatest presidents have had such confidants. To think in the 20th century, there is Woodrow Wilson and Colonel House, or there is Franklin Roosevelt and Harry Hopkins, or there's John F. Kennedy and his brother Robert. Some of our less successful presidents in the 20th century have been those who did not have close friends, who did not have trusted confidants. Nixon trusted nobody, as you all know. Once Bert Lance left Washington, Jimmy Carter had no one of his own age and experience in whom he could confide. And Lincoln had no one either. As a result, though he was constantly surrounded by people, though he was always talking to people, though people were always demanding things from him, he was, throughout the war, the loneliest man in Washington. Thank you very much. Take questions if anybody wants to. The idea is to come down to the microphones in front on each side, if you would, please. And I'll try to be less confusing, maybe. Yes, sir.
Could you speak to the president's relationship with his stepbrother and why they weren't closer and what became of him eventually?
Right. Let me give a little background there. As you know, Lincoln's mother died when he was not quite 10. Thomas Lincoln went back to Kentucky, brought a new bride, Sarah Bush Johnston, a widow with 3 children, 2 girls and a boy of about Lincoln's age, brought back to Indiana. And Sarah Bush Johnston Lincoln treated the Lincoln children absolutely equal with her own. She loved them, she took care of them, she fed them, she clothed them, and they were in terrible shape when she got back there. You would think that with a boy approximately his own age, that the Johnston boy and Lincoln ought to have grown up as friends. They didn't. We don't quite know why. Partly simply temperamental, I suspect. The Johnston boy was rather dull, slow-witted, and not very active. And Lincoln, of course, was the reverse of this. It's also the case that Thomas Lincoln apparently favored his stepson, the Johnston boy, over Lincoln, whom he sometimes beat, and he certainly worked very, very hard. They just didn't get along well. And at times, said one of their relatives, Lincoln and the boy were enemies. So they never grew up together as friends, though they might have. And this deprived him of the one possible source here of an intimate friend in his early years. And that, of course, is a great pity. I think someone's coming down, and then I'll take this question down.
I was wondering if you knew what Lincoln's relationship or friendship with Simeon Francis was? Simeon Francis?
Simeon Francis. I don't know. Simeon Francis was an important figure in Springfield, rather older, I think, than Lincoln, editor of the paper. They did indeed see a good deal of each other. I'm dealing here, I better get back to a microphone, I expect. The Simeon Francis was an important man and in Springfield. Was there a close friendship there? Not that I know of. There are a great many people who thought of themselves and called themselves close friends of Lincoln. And the problem there is that we don't really have any record to go on for most of these. And Lincoln himself referred to a great many people as friends. There's one very peculiar reference to my intimate friend named Bela or some such thing as that, who turned out to be a confectioner who sold candy on the square in Springfield, who appears nowhere else in the whole Lincoln record. So that doesn't tell us really very much. There were a lot of people who knew a great deal about Lincoln, who saw him frequently. One thinks not merely of Simeon Francis, which is important, but also of Grant, of Stanton, and of many others. We do not have any records from these people saying Lincoln shared his ideas with me about Reconstruction, or about the fate of the Union, about race relations, or any of these matters. There's simply no record there that there was this type of intimacy. We do have, for these five men that I have dealt with here, that kind of close relationship and a record of it, which is equally important for the historian. Yes.
I've got a question with two parts. Did Mary Lincoln have the ability to make friendships, and would you consider her a liability for Lincoln with his friends?
All right. Did we get that? Was Mary Lincoln a liability to Lincoln because of her relationship or her ability or inability to make friends? And I think that's an interesting question. First, I do think that Mary Lincoln has been badly treated by historians over the years. She's had a bum rap. Poor lady, she suffered a great deal, and we think of her in those tragic, sad later years rather than in her early years. But we have to remember that, first of all, this was a well-educated, she was clever, she was witty, she was articulate, she was outgoing. And she had great difficulty in accommodating herself to the style, first of all, of Lincoln and of Springfield. If you were brought up in a mansion in Kentucky with slaves to wait on you, to live in a little house in Springfield, not the house, the Lincoln house now, which is double the size of what Mary came to, but a little, really small house in Springfield where child after child, 4 children in a row, where your husband is out on the circuit sometimes for 6 weeks at a time without coming home, where you cook over a hot stove that you bring the wood in from by yourself from the backyard, where you pump your own water from your own pump. This was hard work, and she had difficulty doing it. No wonder, I think, that her temper frayed from time to time, that she was often angry. She did have friends in Springfield, and she helped Lincoln a good deal in the early years. Politically, he said that she had better judgment of character than he did, of who was reliable and who wasn't. But as time went on, of course, things changed considerably, and as Mary got into the White House and got involved in the refurbishing of the White House with huge expenditures that overran the budget, and she didn't know how to make the budget come out right, and she tried to skimp and to save all of these things, coupled with the tragic death of Willie, the most promising of the Lincoln children, turned her into a very different woman by 1862. So after that, I don't think Mary Lincoln was much of an asset to Lincoln, and in turn, he did not confide in her much after he became president, because she'd been notably indiscreet in leaking out secrets. Yes, ma'am.
You refer to slavery as the...
I'm sorry, would you speak a little bit louder?
You refer to slavery as the peculiar institution, and it seems to me that slavery throughout history is the most typical institution, and I just wondered why it's called a peculiar institution.
Well, thank you. My old professor at the University of North Carolina, Fletcher Green, said that the person who finds the first time that slavery was called, quote, the peculiar institution, ought to get a gold medal. Nobody's ever found when that reference came up. It just, oddly enough, emerged in the very end of either the 18th or early years of the 19th century, when all of a sudden one began talking about slavery as the peculiar institution, meaning, of course, that it was confined almost exclusively by that time to the southern states. And over and over again, the Southerners didn't like to talk about, being slave holders. You didn't. You said you had servants if you were properly brought up in the South. You didn't really want to talk about people that you owned slaves. And so, again, you didn't talk about, I'm a slave master. You talked about, I live under the peculiar institution. And this is kind of a euphemism for saying that, well, it's not something we want to talk about too much, but we live with it nevertheless. But I wish you could find that reference for us. If so, we'll give you a gold medal. Anybody else? Yes, sir.
You talked about hypothetical circumstances as to how certain historical events may have come out had Lincoln had close friends to confide in. But I'm wondering, listening to you talk, and most of my knowledge has come from reading your biography of Lincoln. It strikes me that Lincoln had this tremendous ability to be persistent in his own views when all around him were either undermining him or criticizing him, and I'm wondering if he needed to be somewhat of a loner in order to be persistent. And had he had close friends, perhaps they would have advised him away from some of the decisions that he stuck to that we now admire. I wonder if you could comment on that.
That is a very interesting point, I think. And again, we're dealing with hypotheticals, so we don't truly know. I take a great faith in Mary Lincoln's statement about her husband, and John Hay sort of echoed this in a way. Mary Lincoln's statement was, first of all, when her husband made up his mind on something, when he put his foot down flat, and you think of these great size 13 shoes, when he put his foot down, nobody could budge him from it. So probably no advisor was going to budge him on at least fundamental sorts of things. The John Hay statement, though, is perhaps equally interesting. John Hay asked about Lincoln's mental characteristics after the Civil War. John Hay was a very smart, clever, sometimes superficial, but a very bright observer. He said, the problem that Lincoln had in relating to other people was that he was so superior to them. He had outgrown his earlier friends, and he knew that he was superior. He didn't say it, he didn't have to say it. But there were people around him, he said, like Charles Sumner, like Salmon P. Chase, who thought of themselves as being better educated, better qualified, and so on. And they came upon this man who knew that he was smarter than they were, knew that he had made the right decisions, and who certainly was not going to be influenced by him. So one does wonder whether it would have been possible to make major changes. I don't think you could in certain matters, as I've suggested. No advisor could have advised Lincoln to say, well, after all, let those southern states go. It'd be good riddance to get rid of South Carolina and of Mississippi, and these days I might add Texas. But Lincoln wasn't going to accept that. He wasn't going to accept for anybody at all. So some matters he was inflexible on. But surely in the way that he presented his ideas, in the way that he managed things, there might have been some adjustment so that if not a difference in outcome, a difference in public perception. We have to remember, and it often escapes us, that Lincoln, for most of his administration, was an unpopular president, that he was considered incapable, incompetent, and really not doing anything. So that rather than this presentation, a close advisor might have given some ammunition here for saying, we do have a policy, we're following it through, it's a reasonable policy, we defend for these reasons. He had nobody that could help him with that, and he couldn't argue with anybody else because there was nobody around. But again, he wouldn't have accepted any fundamental advice, I'm sure about that. Yes, sir.
Sort of friend if he'd lived longer. Elmer Ellsworth, he was much younger. Elmer Ellsworth, he rose rather quickly just before the war as a leader of a drill team in Illinois. He originally was from New York State. and he was a great favorite of Lincoln, but of course he was killed almost as the war was breaking out in Alexandria in a famous incident, but Lincoln was apparently very fond of him.
Yes. This is, again, an interesting point that one might make in a larger kind of context. Lincoln always liked younger men. He related to them much more easily, and they to him. He was the mentor to many of the young lawyers in Springfield. They studied with him, or they read with him, or he advised them about legal cases, and Ellsworth was such a person. Whether Ellsworth would ever become a major advisor or cabinet person or a leader of an army, this is all I think very doubtful. He was a very young man. But Lincoln was deeply fond of him and surely grieved when he was killed so early. Whether he would be considered an intimate friend or not, I rather doubt, because the President of the United States doesn't normally confide sort of state policy and secrets to a 20-year-old. But there was a relationship here, which unfortunately was terminated. In some sense, John Hay filled this role in the later part of the administration, and he realized that he was a sounding board for Lincoln. John Hay's diary, by the way, is one of the great, wonderful documents of American history. I urge you all to read and enjoy it. Yes.
As you know, or as you know, we have, or we are about to have, a Lincoln Library here. There was a great deal of talk that you would have been the ideal director. There's some talk that you may have been invited and passed on it, and I'd like to ask you if that's true, and if you had been, you were not invited and you had been invited, what would you have done? That's another counterfactual.
That is news to me. That's rewriting history. No, sir, I have never been approached about being director of the marvelous new Lincoln Library and Museum, which we are all going to enjoy and profit from. Nobody ever mentioned it, and I think nobody who knows me would ever have thought of me in that connection. I'm the world's worst administrator. Actually, I have run a number of things at Harvard, primarily on the basis that I so dislike this, I want to get it over with, and let's finish it off quickly. But I doubt if that's the mental attitude for the director here. No, this is not for me. I'm curious, I'm rather flattered that anybody should think that. I think they have a very good new librarian coming in. Richard Norton Smith is going to be a great addition. Yeah.
Do you think Lincoln's struggles with close personal relationships informed his understanding of the relationship between the North and South? And how did Lincoln imagine his role in healing the spiritual rift between Northerners and Southerners following the war?
Can you do the last part a little more slowly?
Sure. Okay, sorry. How did Lincoln imagine his role in healing the spiritual rift between Northerners and Southerners following the war?
Great. Yes, certainly Lincoln looked toward the time that there would be conciliation and that there would be a renewed friendship among Southerners and Northerners. And he felt this, of course, in his own family, where Mary Todd's family had been so badly split, with some serving in the Union Army, some in the Confederate Army, some being killed in the Confederate Army for that matter. And this role of conciliation is clear throughout Lincoln's writings, especially as he goes on in years by the second inaugural, where the whole emphasis here is on let us get back together, let us be brothers together, let us be conciliatory. Now, at the same time, there were some things Lincoln was not going to yield in that. He was not, for example, going to say, oh, let's be friends, and you can keep the African Americans in slavery or something of that sort. No, no. But in terms of personal relationships, of lack of bitterness, he was remarkable. And I think really remarkable throughout American history. It's so tempting in a time of conflict to demonize your enemy and say what evil people they are and how wrong they are and so on. Lincoln really never did this. For instance, there's nothing, you go through all of Lincoln's papers and not find anything attacking Jefferson Davis, for example. who certainly is subject to attack, I think, on a variety of scores. But he did not personalize ever. It was always the idea that sooner or later we've all got to live with each other and live together as Americans. So I think this was the spirit he was going in. And this is why my third scenario, counterfactual, is, I think, really so tragic. If Lincoln had lived, or if somebody else had been vice president other than Andrew Johnson, we might not have had the bitterness that arose immediately after the war. I think that much of that could have been avoided. And of course it wasn't. Thank you. Yes.
Could you please speculate as to what might have happened when Lincoln faced Shields in the duel that was called off?
Yes. I don't know whether everybody knows that story or not, but early on, while Lincoln was still in the courtship mode, I think just about, there was controversy about an Illinois official named James Shields, Irish-born, Democrat, rather pompous, self-important, but very bright and clever. And somebody published in the local paper, Simeon Francis, his name comes up here again, in the local papers, a series of letters signed Rebecca, attacking and ridiculing James Shields, whose vanity was profound anyway, and whose feathers were easily ruffled. And he demanded that the author be exposed so that he could call him to account. And ultimately, Lincoln took the blame for it, though in fact he hadn't written, maybe Todd had probably written much of it. But all of this ultimately led to a challenge toward a duel. The duel, fortunately, did not occur, but it was all scheduled, and they were to go on an island, I believe, opposite Alton, Illinois, out of the Mississippi, where it would be more or less legal to fight a duel and try to kill each other. Lincoln chose as his weapons broadswords, which gave him, in some ways, a great advantage, because with his height and his length of arm and a broadsword sticking out of there, he could reach Shields, who was a little squat man who couldn't have, and so it might not have worked out well for Shields. Fortunately, it didn't come off. Mediators intervened, but it was a source of great embarrassment to Lincoln. And years later, during the presidency, somebody indiscreetly referred to it in his presence, and he flushed and said, and I don't want to ever hear that mentioned again. That's not a subject. It would be interesting to speculate what American history might have been had Shields killed Abraham Lincoln in 1840 on an island in the Mississippi River. But then there's so many ifs. But then, of course, I've been playing with ifs all evening, haven't I? I think we're all right. Well, thank you all very much.
We Are Lincoln Men is published by Simon & Schuster, on the web at simonsays.com. Next week on Public Lives, the grandchildren of Winston Churchill and their two books on the former Prime Minister of England.
Does not reveal his secrets. But here then is my problem and my paradox. I would like to explore how a man who had no intimate friends was also a man who had nothing but friends. And that is the theme of this new book. In working on it, I think of it as an exploration in not merely of Lincoln and Illinois and of the Civil War period, but an exploration of friendship, the meaning of friendship, and of its significance as shaping political and public behavior. To do this, I found it very difficult to know exactly where to go for sources. Naturally, I went back to the records of the time. I went back to the interviews that Herndon collected to find out what his so-called friends said about Lincoln, and got remarkably little out of them. I turned next to the works of some sociologists and educators who've done important work in studying the importance of friendship, especially in the early years. And I learned even more from conversations and correspondence with some leading psychoanalysts who explore the problems caused by the lack of close friends. But even these did not satisfy me. The work of these specialists led me back to the history of philosophy. And I began reading, improbably enough for an American historian, what Montaigne, what Thomas Aquinas, and what Cicero had to say about friendship. So that one old-timer out in New Salem, when asked the secret of Lincoln's success, gave a succinct 5-word explanation. He said, Lincoln had nothing but friends. But the same people began asking other people who knew Lincoln perhaps even better and more intimately over a longer period of time, and they rejected that explanation. John Todd Stewart, Lincoln's first law partner, thought that Lincoln was incapable of friendship. Lincoln did forget his friends. Stewart said, there was no part of his nature which drew him into acts of gratitude for his friends. He was by some considered cold-hearted, at least indifferent toward his friends, agreed another Illinois politician who worked with him for 30 years. He was the warm friend of few men, said Governor Oglesby of Illinois. He added a bit lamely, but he was the friend of mankind. David Davis, the judge who was responsible more than any other man for Lincoln's nomination in 1860, said Lincoln had no strong emotional feelings for any person, for mankind or thing. And William Henry Herndon, Lincoln's law partner for 16 years, agreed with these appraisals. Lincoln, he said, rose through his own exertions. He did not rise because he had friends. He was, Herndon declared, the most shut-mouthed man who ever existed. I love that phrase, shut-mouthed man. Isn't that a wonderful phrase to describe a politician who does?
Next on Public Lives, Pulitzer Prize-winning historian David Herbert Donald explores the friendships of Abraham Lincoln in his latest, We Are Lincoln Men. It lasts an hour.
David Herbert Donald is clearly the world's leading expert on Abraham Lincoln, the man and the president. Though his famous book, Lincoln, is universally considered the definitive biography of the president, Professor Donald uses his new book, We Are Lincoln Men, to reveal another, often overlooked side of this legend. Professor Donald explores the life of one of the most private and mysterious presidents through the eyes of his closest friends and offers valuable insights into how his relationships affected his presidency. Professor Donald's book, Lincoln, won the prestigious Lincoln Prize and was a bestseller. He has twice won the Pulitzer Prize for a biography. In 1961 for Charles Sumner and the Coming of the Civil War, and in 1988 for Look Homeward, A Life of Thomas Wolfe. He is the Charles Warren Professor Emeritus of American History and American Civilization at Harvard University. Please welcome to Chicago, David Herbert Donald.
Oh, thank you very much. It really is a joy to be back in Chicago. Such a wonderful city, such an exciting city. And I've always loved it and hope to come back more and more frequently. I thought I'd talk tonight a little about this new book of mine called We Are Lincoln Men, and perhaps I ought to begin by explaining the title. It comes from a letter that John Hay, one of Lincoln's private secretaries, wrote to his other secretary, John G. Nicolay, in the 1880s when they were preparing their, they thought, definitive 10-volume magisterial biography of Lincoln using the Lincoln Papers for the first time. They were both ardent Republicans, but they didn't want to make this sound like a campaign document in 10 volumes. So Hay wrote to Nicolay, we want to seem absolutely impartial in our presentation. We want readers to think of us as two seraphims on clouds above, twanging their harps impartially as they recount the history of the war. And then Hay said, But there's one reservation about this. We do remember all the way through that we are Lincoln men. This is a book about people who thought of themselves as Lincoln men. They were close friends, they thought, of Lincoln, and their relationship to Lincoln, I think, tells something about them. It tells even more about the president, and I hope it tells something about the importance of friendship in history. Now, shortly after Lincoln's assassination, people, biographers, historians, began asking questions, naturally enough, of how did this man who came from such an undistinguished background, who had hard-scrabble beginnings, who had little education, who had no wealth, he had no family behind him, how did such a man rise to power, to success, and how did he come to be so completely capable as president? When they asked these questions about those who had known Lincoln back in his Illinois days, they got almost always the same kinds of answers. They were told again and again that Lincoln rose because of his capacity to make and to hold friends. For instance, just take one little episode. During his brief service in the Black Hawk War in the 1830s, he so endeared himself to the men in his company that 30 years later, they remembered Lincoln was our idol, one soldier said. There was not a man but was obedient to every word he spoke and would fight to the death for Lincoln. All the men in the company, said another, as well as the regiment to which he and they belonged, claimed that they almost worshiped Lincoln. In every phase of his life, he attracted such devoted kinds of followers.